Awesome. So welcome to our panel. This is negotiating freelance contracts, how to keep friends, how to keep friends, have fun, and make money. I'm Moni Barrette. I'm a comics librarian and co-founder for Creators Assemble. This is weird looking at both sides, but I'm going to be the moderator for our discussion today. And special thanks to Knowhere Games Comics, which is located in beautiful San Marcos, California, for hosting this event today. But I would like to loop in our esteemed panelists, Gamal Hennessy and Mr. Joseph Illidge. Hi guys, how are you?
Hello.
Thanks for joining us today.
No problem.
Great to be here. Thank you for having us.
Yay. So before we fully get rolling, can I have each one of you introduce yourselves and your background to our viewers?
Joe, you go first. You're smart.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, man, you're so kind. So my name is Joseph Illidge. I am presently the executive editor of Heavy Metal Magazine. So in that capacity, I deal with creators from all over the globe, and Heavy Metal has different types of deals from company-owned IP to creator-owned to licensing to creator-shared. So there's a variety of different types of contracts. And I've been in the comic book industry for almost 30 years, starting at Milestone and DC Comics.
And my name is Gamal Hennessy. I am an author, attorney, and business consultant who specializes in the comic book industry. I've been working in comics in some capacity or another since 1999. I recently just published a book called The Business of Independent Comic Book Consulting that Joe actually wrote the foreword on, which was actually quite good.
Oh, nice.
And it's actually a complete analysis on how to build a comic book company for your own intellectual property. And I am currently working on the follow-up to that book, which is The Business of Freelance Comic Book Publishing. So a lot of stuff that we'll be talking about today comes from research that I have already done for that book.
Okay, great. And actually put a pin in that book thought, because I'd like to provide links to everyone who attended today and everyone who's watching for where to buy that, because that sounds insanely helpful. So thank you both. Just a little bit of background about why this class or this panel came about. I actually handle the freelance contracts for Creators Assemble. We do work with a number of indie artists, writers, letterers, inkers, colorers, all of that, and find them gigs, usually across San Diego County, but also nationally as well. And I also deal with, in my day job, the distribution rights for digital comics with lots of major comics publishers. So I've been on both sides of the agreement table, and we've definitely, with Creators Assemble, it's one of our big missions to help indie creatives make a living or do what they love in this space. But it can be really difficult, the business end of doing things, when your passion is writing or drawing and not so much looking at someone you care about and telling them that you need money from them. So that's what we're here to kind of overcome today. So my first question is, can you give some examples and some good reasons? Why do you always need a contract, even if it is someone that you're close to?
Joe, you want me to get started?
Yeah, why don't you kick it off, and I'm going to follow your lead.
Okay, so basically anytime that you are actually creating a comic, you are creating intellectual property. Intellectual property can have inherent value that can actually lead to millions, if not billions of dollars. Many of the companies that people are synonymous with comic books, whether you're talking about Disney or Warner Brothers or Marvel or DC, they are built on intellectual property. The only way you can actually just understand who owns that property is if there is a contract. So it does not actually matter from my standpoint. And before I go any further, I have to say, as I'm an attorney, that this is not legal advice and we have not created an attorney-client relationship. But if you're creating something in terms of a comic book, you could potentially be creating the next big thing. There's no one knows whether what you're creating is going to be Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or radioactive adolescent black belt hamsters. You have to actually treat everything as if it is going to be a major piece of intellectual property. And that means you need to know when you're creating it, who owns what it is that you're creating. Do you own it? Does a person who's paying you own it? Do you own it together? If you don't actually understand those things in a written form, because it does people no good to actually decide what they're going to be doing in terms of intellectual property verbally, because people will inevitably have one perception of a project they're working on when there's no money on the table. And they will have a different perception of that property when Netflix calls. Memories will shift. People will all of a sudden not really know what's going on, and you will create more tension and friction, and you may destroy a potentially very lucrative situation by not actually having the fundamental agreements laid out in the beginning. That's it.
That's a great follow-up. Leland, to follow that up, one of the things about the comic book industry in particular, and I think this goes to a number of creative industries, is that people forget that because they love something deeply, that it is a business. The comic book industry is a business, just like Tropicana orange juice, just like Nike, everything is a business. And you need an agreement that lays out the terms, not for when things are going well, for if things go sideways, right? There needs to be a clarity of terms, and that way everybody knows what they're getting into, everybody knows what are the conditions of this arrangement. And to go to an aspect of your question about people that you know, if you're getting in the business with people that you know, I dare say it's doubly important to have contracts, because nuances and relationships can complicate things if, to Gamal's point, something can become the next Walking Dead. So when you are working together, you may be friends. In the context of the business aspects of it, you have different roles, whether it's co-ownership, whether it's work for hire, and what does that involve? But again, comfort comes from clarity. Tension comes from an absence of clarity.
I love that.
Absolutely.
Just like any good relationship, you need to have that communication, and sometimes it needs to be expressly spelled out. So thank you both for that answer. So, and you had mentioned terms, Joseph. So my next question is actually, generally speaking, again, we're not giving direct attorney-client advice, right? What types of terms should you make sure that you want to include or consider for all of your contracts?
I think, oh, sorry, Gamal, you go first.
Well, the way because every contract is going to be different, especially when you're talking about the nature of the business model and the nature of the contractual relationship. There are a lot of different terms that are going to go into each one of those contracts. But generally, what I try to explain to my clients is you have to actually look at three broad aspects of the deal. What are your responsibilities? Where is the revenue coming from? And what are your rights? So in terms of responsibilities, like what is it that you have to do in this deal to actually fulfill your contractual obligations? Do you have to produce a certain number of pages? Do you have to actually publish a book? What is it that has to get done? And when does those responsibilities kick in? Revenue is how exactly are both sides or one side making money from this deal? If there's money changing hands, you need to know how much money, when it's changing hands, under what conditions, and under what conditions would that not happen? And finally, you have to understand the relationship of each person involved in the contract and their rights, because comics are the foundation of comics from a business standpoint is intellectual property rights. Someone will inevitably own what is being created. So you have to understand what is being owned by whom in relationship to the revenue and the rights. So once you actually understand the interplay of the rights, the revenue, and the responsibilities, you will have a much better understanding of the deal, no matter what kind of deal it is, whether it's a freelance deal or a licensing deal or a creator-owned deal or whatever.
And something I'd like to add that really meets at the Venn diagram point of all three of those is the deadline, right? So There are deliverables. When do those deliverables have to be provided by the client to the client by? There's payment. When is payment activated? And when are you expected to receive payment? And those things, right? The deadline, the timing of everything becomes really crucial, because within that could be consequences if timing isn't met.
Mhm.
So then that's kind of a follow-up question that I have is, sometimes when you're doing legal things, it's good to leave some wiggle room for interpretation. But it sounds like you're both saying that with this type of contract, it's good to be really specific on deliverables, timeline, deadlines, all of that.
Absolutely, because the comic book industry, well, first, there's certain aspects of the comic book industry you have to understand that are different from other types of entertainment industries. The comic book industry is geographically dispersed when it comes to production. This means that the creative team can be scattered all around the world at any given point, and they can still be producing comics on a regular basis. The other part of it is that most Western comics are made on a kind of assembly line situation. The writer has to write the story before the letterer can get started. The colorist can't work if the art's not done. So everybody has to actually be in sync in terms of this production timeline. And if one person decides they're just going to be 2 months late, now the entire process falls apart. And there are, once the book itself is done, if you're just talking about creating a book, there are a lot of other dominoes in the production, the publishing timeline of a comic, that if one piece is out of whack, and Joe can speak to this much more directly than I can, then you miss final order cutoff, you miss the printing ship deadline. If the things are getting printed in China, now all of a sudden the book is not a week late, it's 3 months late. The retailer's shelf is not now empty. They paid for the stuff up front. The entire thing's falling apart because the letterer decided not to show up for a week. So timing and deliverables is one of the most important things in comics, which is why I try to always tie deliverables to payment. So as soon, if you know someone wants to get paid, well, you say, okay, you can get paid as soon as you deliver the thing. And they are much more incentivized to deliver the thing because they want the money. If you give them all the money up front, and I've had clients who do this, you give them all the money up front, and then you're surprised when the delivery does not come when the delivery is supposed to come. Well, why would they? They already have the money. They're gone. Joe, does that make sense?
Right. And absolutely. And, when you're talking about, once again, you're talking about the industry as a business, and we're not just talking the direct market, we're talking the entire comic book and graphic novel industry, which now includes and primarily is about trade book publishers. You're talking about companies with schedules 2 years out. Content has to be completed so that a marketing and sales team has time to go to different bookstores, bookstore chains, libraries, and secure sales. So your action does not exist in a vacuum. Your action is part of a collective process. And so not only from a business standpoint, but as a team player, you want to meet your responsibilities in timely fashion. Now, chaos happens, of course, and part of that requires a good talking relationship with your editor or your client. And at the first sign of trouble, reach out to them. I recommend electronically. I can't speak to the legal power of an email, but for me personally, and I really advise this, and again, this goes to clarity of understanding. If there's an email exchange, then at least both sides know this happened, we conversed upon this, and we're proceeding forward, right? So you're part of a process, and ultimately that is going to affect your future in the business, because companies And collaborators are not going to want to work with people that they cannot trust. So above and beyond what a contract symbolizes, there's a trust factor that is intrinsically connected to it.
I love that. And Joseph, I feel like you're just like perfectly teeing up the next questions for me each time. So in this case, so you mentioned electronic communication. So you have something basically in writing, more or less. You know, and we mentioned at the top that it's not always a creative person's first strong suit, right? To have some of these difficult conversations. What are some of your best tips and strategies, A, for overcoming any anxiety you might have about having the conversation, B, for like, how long should you let things go, or should you nip it right in the bud immediately? And also, like you said, how should you do it in writing? What's the best way to go about these things?
Right. So it's interesting. For me, I come from it from two angles. I come from it from the editorial angle for different clients, but I also come from it as a writer of graphic novels and comic books and children's books. So to answer the question of the absence of comfort of the conversation, I think it's important for both parties to establish a relationship up front, right? Like, we're working together. You don't have to feel afraid or nervous about telling me something, right? So it should really be done as soon as possible. I consider it equivalent to when you used to get a beating from your mom, right? Like, you did something wrong, you're going to try to avoid it, but you're not. And the longer you go, you may actually be multiplying the nature of the beating that you're going to get. So you might as well just deal with it immediately and just get it over with, right? And then once you've gotten over that hurdle, and I do really recommend, again, emails. I know there's issues about tone, but as human beings, we have the capacity to control that. And then after that, it's okay, well, when will you have it by, right? It's reestablishing what the new timeline is, because again, there have to be those boundaries, and those boundaries help keep the trains running on time.
In a lot of situations, I usually recommend, and again, I get involved most times very early in the process, before the comic is actually made. Although there are many times a client will come to me with a contract, the comic book already made, it's already being printed, and now they want a contract to cover the stuff they already did. This is not the best way to do it, but that's sometimes what happens. But a lot of times what I would recommend, especially in the production process, is to have weekly or at least bi-weekly check-ins or discussions that are going on between everybody, because again, people are geographically dispersed, just to make sure that you're not waiting for something bad to happen just to check in. You want to actually be delivering, you don't want to necessarily deliver like all of your material at the end, just from not even, this is not even legal or business, this is just from a creative standpoint, to make sure that what it is that you're producing is what the editor or the client had in mind. So if you're being asked to produce 22 pages, deliver in batches of 3 or 4 so that everybody sees the cadence, everybody's, if you tie the payment to the delivery, everybody can see what's happening, everybody knows that they're getting paid, work is being done. So it's not, you don't only have conversations when something goes wrong, you're having conversations on a constant basis. That way, if something does go wrong, there's already a meeting set up, there's already a check-in set up so that you can discuss things in a normal flow of business. It's just like any other industry that has a production process. You want to have things kind of discussed on an ongoing basis. The analogy that I usually go to is film. When a production company goes to make a film for a studio, they don't just deliver the film at the end, they're dailies. They actually deliver a little piece of this thing every single day so that the people paying for it go, okay, this is working or it's not working, because nobody wants to find out at the end of the process that the whole thing is wrong and it has to be redone. It's much better to have those incremental conversations, like Joe said, in email format. Now, from a contractual standpoint, it all depends on how the contract is written, but many older contracts do not actually utilize email as official, quote unquote, official notice. You have to put stuff in the mail and nonsense like that. Nowadays, though, modern contracts, emails are an equivalent form of notice, but then text messages or DMs on TikTok are not necessarily notice. If you're working on a deal with somebody, you probably want to understand what kind of communication you already have with the person and use that for notice, as opposed to kind of however you may find the person using that for notice.
Yep, definitely. Very important. With more means of communication, that doesn't mean that all of them, as Gamal pointed out, have the same kind of import when you're talking about things like scheduling. And to his point, I think as a creator, you're working for a company, it behooves you to ask up front, what is the schedule of the project? It behooves you to find out upfront, what are your dates? So when I bring on new creators, if it's for a multi-issue project, I usually try to give them their dates for the entire project. If it's 5 issues, I give you the dates for all 5 issues. And that way, number one, you have a sense of the larger obligation in terms of time, but also that helps you measure how you deliver material. And to Gamal's point, if you're a person that delivers on a timely manner, usually when you don't, when you miss, it will be understood that that's an anomaly.
Because yeah, you set up the pattern of trust up front. You've already proven that you are a conscientious professional who is delivering on time. So if something happens and life, what I usually say is life always gets in the way of comics, unfortunately. So there are going to be holidays, vacations, things with kids, illnesses, pandemics, supply chain issues, all sorts of things will happen. And a lot of times the editor or the client will build that into their schedule. But the dates that they're giving you are the dates that you need to hit, and not assume that they are flexible or not assume that you can. Comic book creators have to be creative on a schedule. And for some creative individuals, that is counterintuitive. However, that is how the business of comics works. How you, as a creator, kind of create your art and how you manage inspiration and your muses, that is personal to you, but the deadline is the deadline. And the entire industry writ large cannot wait until you get struck by a bolt of inspiration before you actually turn in the script, because the whole thing will break down.
I love all of that. So to touch on those points, bring them all in again. So relationship building, but even if it's just professional, and whether you've worked together one time or you're going to work together 100 times, sounds like from the perspective of the person that's doing the employing, having that schedule worked out with wiggle room in there for stuff that is inevitably going to happen. And then as you're building that relationship and having those check-ins, scheduled in, then you'll be able to keep track of, like you said, you're hitting those deadlines. And if not, it's an anomaly and everyone's assuming positive intent and you move forward in a way that benefits everyone. I love that. Also, it sounds like you're saying too, and that is a good thing to note, with all the different communication methods, it sounds like maybe even having that in the agreement or having that stated up front is you'll email or you'll have a Zoom call or whatever it is. Does that sound like a smart play too?
Yeah, there's a provision in most contracts, and it's usually in the last third of the contract, one of the parts of the contract that people don't usually read, called the notice provision. And the notice provision actually lays out how the parties will actually communicate with each other, whether they're going to use registered mail, or they're going to use regular mail, or they're going to use email. For a while, it was fax. You could fax somebody, but nobody does that anymore. And some people, depending on their relationships, they will say there could be phone conversations or text message conversations. The problem with phone and phone conversations is in the worst case scenario. If there is, you need to go back and check the record of what actually happened because there's some kind of litigation, then a phone call is not going to be helpful because now you have to get somebody to sit up there and say what actually happened in the phone call. At the very least, if the way Joe said it, if there's an email chain back and forth, email is introduced in evidence in court cases all the time. So an email chain can be useful when you're trying to figure out who did what. But even if it's not a court case, if you're trying to understand what's happening with the particular production of a book or a comic, and you're trying to understand what happened, if you have an email chain, then you at least know, okay, this person said they were going to deliver this thing on this day. We missed this deadline, but we agreed on this one later. There's something in writing. If things go to phone or, I don't know, Snapchat or something that's going to disappear later, that's not helpful to anybody. So it makes sense to actually, however you're going to communicate about this professional relationship, keep it in a medium that everybody can go back to later and everyone has access to.
100%. And, really in back of that, Gamal mentioned something that really goes to the core of this, which is people don't like to read contracts. And that's a big problem. They're going to have to set themselves up to like reading them. They're going to have to set themselves up to take the time to read the entire thing. And if there's something that they're uncomfortable with, make a list of those things and then ask the questions. There is this general fear that you can't ask questions, that if you ask questions, you won't get the job. If you ask questions, you will be considered a problem. Ask those questions anyway and immediately.
What I usually tell people, and this is, it's not necessarily cynical, but it does help. If you don't like reading contracts, because as a lawyer, I will readily admit contracts are not written in ways for people who are not lawyers to understand them. They're kind of written in a way that you don't really know what it is that's being talked about. So it's always helpful to know someone or hire someone who understands contracts, who will basically translate the contract into English for you. And then it'll have this, it could be a long 3 pages worth of stuff. And all it really says is, you don't own the rights to this anymore. But if someone can explain that to you, you'll be much more comfortable making decisions about the document that's in front of you. And depending on your leverage, depending on what kind of power you have in that situation, like Joe said, it makes perfect sense to, if there are things that you cannot deal with in that contract, those deal breakers for you, then you need to either get them changed or not sign the contract. It does you no good. It doesn't do anyone. Well, it does some people. It doesn't do any good for you to sign a contract that you're uncomfortable with, because that means you're giving up things that you didn't want to give up. You're doing things you don't want to do, and you're not getting the revenue that you think that you should get, which means you're not going to produce good work. There's no point in getting involved in that deal. So, and the key here, if you're uncomfortable about what's in a contract, if you're uncomfortable about what's being asked of you, and you want to change things, the key there is to blame your lawyer, because no one likes lawyers anyway. So it's not as if our reputation is going to get worse if you go to your potential client and say, well, I would like to sign this, but my lawyer said we have to change this, this, and this. Then the thing could get changed and the other side could get angry, but they're not angry at you. They're angry at the lawyer. And people are already angry at lawyers, so whatever. Let them be angry. As long as you get to where you're comfortable, you pay us to actually deal with the brunt of their anger.
I love
and
that.
it's an investment.
Absolutely.
Right? Like people that's not the place to push it off. That's not the thing to say, I'll get to that later. You started working on the project. Oh, now I'll get to the lawyer. No, have that ally up front. And that will help prevent a lot of agita from ever coming to pass.
I love that. Yeah, and I mean, from the other side of the table, if you're somebody who doesn't want to hire someone because they ask questions, you're probably someone that person shouldn't want to be working with, right? And someone who's hiring you should want you to be comfortable and should want everybody to come to a good agreement. And I've definitely pulled my lawyer, I would love to sign this, but my lawyer had some questions for you.
Yeah, do that all the time. It's fine.
The village bad guy. And I think too, if you have to put the resources into having a lawyer help you at first, eventually you'll start to learn that, similar types of contracts are going to have similar types of language in them. You'll start to get better and more literate with those too. And you won't need the help.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because one of the things that I do with my clients is educate them on the process. So I say, okay, this clause is acceptable and this is why. So the next time you get that contract, if you see that clause and it looks pretty much the same, you go, okay, that's fine. And then I've had clients that when I first started working with them, I had to it was much more hand-holding of what it is that they were doing with those contracts. But 4 or 5 years later, they've been in the business. Now they call me for the nuances of very specific deals if things change. But by and large, they handle their own deals. A lot of times clients will come to me and I will understand their business, draft them a contract for their business. And then actually, I think Joe was one of my clients at a certain point. And then Joe never had to actually come back to me for anything because it's all in that one document. Now I was like, okay, Joe's go off and make his millions. He doesn't need me anymore.
Not true.
Gamal out of a job, I think, is what we're looking for here.
Well, again, it starts with understanding the importance of having legal representation as an ally and clarity of understanding of an agreement.
100. So with that in mind, what are some common red flags that you see in the agreement process or in the agreements themselves? And how can you kind of avoid or negotiate around those common things?
Okay, well, the first thing that is a huge red flag is a lack of contract. If someone comes to you and wants to hire you for a project, but they don't want to give you a contract, that is a red flag. You should not work with that person. Or you should say, well, I would love to do this project for you, but my lawyer says we need a contract. And then you can just bring in the contract and it's fine. A contentious negotiating period where almost everything that you're asking for, even if it's reasonable, even if it's standard in the industry, if they're fighting you on it, that usually speaks to the mentality or the mindset of the person that you're working with. And it could be, and it's not always the case, because some people are very tough negotiators up front, but when you actually sign the deal, they're the greatest people to work with ever. But that's not always the case. So if you get a lot of friction on a lot of things with the contract, that may be an indication of how the actual working relationship will be, and you'll have to actually, figure out if that makes sense for you. Inflexibility in negotiations. A lot of times, because people are coming at a contract or a deal from two different perspectives and two different business motivations, they're going to want different things. And in the best case scenario, everybody figures out a way to structure the deal so that everybody gets what they want. But if you're trying to work out a contract with someone who does not want to give you anything and only wants what they want, this is going to be a problem in terms of actually A, resolving the contract so you can actually move forward, and B, working with them later on. And the last thing is usually a discrepancy between what they say and what is actually in the document. So a lot of times people will come to me and say, well, the publisher said the contract says this, and then they will give me the contract. And I'll say, actually, the contract says something completely different. That is not what the contract says. And that cognitive dissonance is often disturbing to people because they want to believe what they heard, and they don't necessarily want to believe what's on the piece of paper. But there's another clause in the contract, which is called the entire agreement clause, which basically says everything on the piece of paper is what the deal is. Anything that I told you verbally, or I said to you in an email, or that we discussed after like 6 cocktails, is not the deal. The deal is what's on the piece of paper. So if there's any discrepancy between what I said and what's on the piece of paper is what controls. So if there's a discrepancy there, you have to figure out why that discrepancy is there and work that out so that what's on the piece of paper is what you actually wanted to agree to in the first place.
I would follow all that great advice up by saying, to me, there are 2 types of red flags. One is anything that makes your spider sense tingle, or anything that gives you an upset stomach. Mm-hmm. Anything you see in a contract that's a speed bump, that's a red flag. For reasons that may not be universal, it may be specifically for you. Secondly, and this is kind of like the editor in me, but this is something that one of my lawyers told me, I take it seriously, typographical errors. It seems like nothing, but depending on where it is, it changes the nature of something. Mm-hmm. So I think the language should be clear and the language should be correctly spelled.
Well, and from the employment perspective, if they don't take the time to make clear language in an agreement, like why then should you be taking the time to read it, to sign it, to work for them? So that's a good point too. You know, I'm coming from the other side of things. I've worked with a lot of independent folks who have been loath to sign things for smallish jobs. Do you have any like words of wisdom for folks who don't want to sign their name to something? How do they get over that fear?
First of all, there is no small job. In the comic book industry, we do not know what the next big thing is going to be. The example that there's 2 examples. One is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Yes,
was a parody.
100%.
Yeah, was a parody of the 4 top kind of books of the 1980s that Eastman and Laird put together in black and white, just, for fun. And then it became a $200 million property. That is not a small deal. There are characters, there are concepts, like just even if you take what's going on right now, She-Hulk was made not because Stan Lee was inspired to make She-Hulk, but because at a certain point, CBS had the rights to Hulk, and he didn't want them to introduce another type of character that he didn't get to control, so he just made it. And that's what it is. There is no, if you're investing time and effort and creativity and money into a book, then it is not a small deal. The only time you might consider it a quote unquote small deal is if you are making a comic for an audience of 1. Like if you're making a comic for your kid and you're drawing it, you're writing it, you're printing it, you're handing it to the kid. Okay, you don't necessarily need to hire me to negotiate with Diamond for you for this book because, well, you hand it to your kid, kid loves it, it's great. Don't get a contract for that. For everything else, you need, if it's going on Webtoons, you still need contract with everyone involved. If you and your best friend are making a book, you need contracts. If your partner, your significant other is building the website for your comic, you need a contract. If your mom is doing the accounting, you need a contract. Not because any of these people are trying to do something detrimental to you, but like Joe said in the beginning, you need a clear understanding of what people are or are not supposed to be doing and when they're supposed to be doing it and what you're giving them for that. So there are no small deals. Everyone needs a contract. And Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That's it.
The best example there is, and I would say 2 things. Number 1, if you have a problem signing a contract, then you're not ready to engage in any business.
Mhm.
All business is founded on agreements. That's something that you need to reconcile with yourself, or you cannot engage in any business. Anecdotally, something that a bunch of us are probably really familiar with, and it was hysterical, but it also really made a statement, was the episode of She-Hulk, where basically She-Hulk had to go to court with Titania because Titania bought the trademark to She-Hulk. And it was something that Jennifer Walters, she dismissed. She didn't care about it. She didn't care about it until someone took it, legally controlled it, and abused it, and used it to their advantage to make money, to become famous, to become popular. And she saw it as some kind of injustice. So ideas have value. They have legal value. And so you have to take them seriously. If you're not willing to sign a contract, I dare say you do not take your ideas seriously. And I can almost guarantee you someone will steal it from you and they will show you what is possible, right? Take your ideas seriously, value them, take yourself seriously.
Yeah, the entire history of the comic book industry, especially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is emblematic of this concept, because a lot of these writers and artists did not want to tell people they were in the comic book industry. So they didn't worry about the contracts. They didn't worry about owning the IP, because they saw it as just a way to make the page rate now so they can pay their rent. They were not thinking about multi-billion-dollar entertainment enterprises because A, there was no such thing, and B, they did not actually see the value of this intellectual property. That's how you got problems like Kirby and Ditko and Bill Finger and all these other people, because there was one group of people, Stan Lee and others, who understood there was value here and they needed to own that value. And then there was other people who didn't. The one thing that's actually happening now, the past 10 to 15 years, that didn't happen back then, is people are getting into the business and they understand that there is inherent value in what they're creating and that they want to own a piece of that because they see that there's money in it. So if you're, like Joe said, if you're not willing to sign a deal for your work, then you either A, don't believe in your work, or B, you're not planning on doing the work because you don't want to sign something. And C, there is no real way for you to enter the industry if you're not willing to sign the contract. Now, you don't have to want to sign freelance contracts, because some people are very anti-freelance. So they only want to sign creator owns, they only want to sign publishing deals. That's fine. If you want to only sign a certain type of deal, all that means is you have a particular business model and your contracts need to reflect your business model. But the idea that you don't want to sign any deal, that's going to be a problem. This is exactly how Joe described it.
And everyone watching or listening to this should watch the Batman and Me documentary about Bill Finger and Batman. Everyone should watch that right now on Hulu.
I know what I'm doing this evening then. Awesome. Sounds like everybody else here has seen it. So I'm going to allow some time for Q&A from the folks that are here at the shop. But before we get to that, do you have any resources you can recommend, or ways to even find an attorney in this space? Like, what are the best ways to get the help that someone might want?
Joe, you want to start?
Wow, that's really tricky. For me, it's really been, if you're in the business, speak to other colleagues in the business. Who is your representative in this regard? Word of mouth is really powerful, even in this digital age, really powerful. So that is what I've learned. When you're a creator, especially in comics, you become part of a network, and that network is a group of people that they all want to help one another. So if there's something or someone that you need and you don't have it, it's quite likely that someone in your network can give you a referral.
Yeah, there's actually the problem with comic book law as a specific field of law is that there's really only 10 to 15 individuals that I know of who practice it on a regular basis.
Unicorns like you.
Yeah, and like most of us all know each other. We know where each other is. Like for Comic-Con next week, I think out of those 12 people, 7 of them are going to be on a panel that we're doing on like Friday. So hopefully nothing happens to us, because that's going to be most of the comic book attorneys just wiped out in one fell swoop. But there's like, for myself, I offer free consultations to anyone who is looking to make any kind of deal in comics. So if you just go to my website, type in what you're looking for, we set you up with a free consultation. We figure out what it is that you might want to do. But if I can't help you, like I said, I know of a lot of these individuals who specialize in comic book law. And some of them, like I may send you to one person who does comic book law, but he also does film and television deals, if that's where you're going. If you need another type of person because you might have to go to court, I will send you to another person. And so depending on what it is that you actually need and how it is that you're planning on going about it, we can help you figure that out. But that's going to be part of that network of, well, who actually understands how this industry works, because a lot of people they make the mistake of thinking any person with a law degree can help them with their comic book contract. And that is not the case, not because comic book law is this kind of intricate, like only geniuses can do it kind of thing, but it's a quirky kind of specific type of business. So if you know someone who does like insurance litigation defense, you hand them a comic book law contract, they're not gonna be able to help you. Medical malpractice, mergers and acquisitions, they don't know. Not because they can't figure it out, but you don't want to be the first person, you don't want to be their test case. So just go to somebody who knows how the business works and what it is that you need to look for in your deals, and you will be miles ahead of everybody else.
Definitely. And to wrap that, I would be remiss is if I did not mention the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. The URL is cbldf.org. You can look up Comic Book Legal Defense Fund on Google. Just send an email asking, I need representation. Can you recommend lawyers? And members of the fund will be glad to do that, right? It's an organization that has been around for years, and it's really about helping creators and publishers work better with each other in that way. So send an email to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund.
They are amazing. I'll add they're in our physical local space out here. And they have one of those, what was it, 7 or 15 lawyers that actually specialize in this, working with them. I will mention too that Creators Assemble, we are comprised largely of librarians. We're all about networking also. So we actually hold networking industry events. We have a networking Discord. We have a lot of middle and well-known creators in there that can help refer people to people they've been working with. So between all of us, we got you covered, right?
Absolutely.
That would be fair to say.
Awesome. So did anyone in the shop here have any questions today? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a new creator. I write my own comics. And one of the tough things that I've noticed about trying to find artists, inkers, colors, whatever, is, and like trying to take that step towards having a contract is, as a new creator, how do you go about being like, compensating them if money is an issue, right? So like, I don't have the money to be able, like, I'm very thankful. My current artist is a friend and coworker, and I completely understand still wanting a contract to avoid any confusion down the road. But how do you tie that in with maybe a stranger, right? If I were to meet you, be like, I'm new, I write, I'm confident, you got good stuff, but I just can't pay you till we make money. Like, what do you recommend going about approaching that kind of situation?
when you're talking about compensation for comics, there are several different types of compensation depending on how you're going to structure the deal. So the basic type of compensation in a freelance model is a page rate or an hourly rate or a flat fee. But if you do not actually have the cash upfront to pay, you can offer to not have a freelance relationship. You can offer to have a collaborative relationship where you're actually giving that other person a piece of the IP. This means that you're now working together to get this book out the door, and you're, by definition, in that contract, are deciding how you're going to split up all the potential revenue that comes from that book, whether it's the crowdfunding sales or the theatrical TV sales or the merchandise sales. You figure out how all the money is going to get divided. There's also, you can provide credit for people in the book, which is a natural kind of thing that you can give as compensation. You can give them a discount on purchasing copies in the future so that they can then turn around and sell those direct to consumer. You can you can barter services. So like if they have a project and they want you to work on their project, you're going to work on this project. As long as it's actually in the contract and you both feel like you're getting value, there's different types of compensation that you can provide. However, I would recommend that you figure out some way to pay actual cash upfront, whether that's delaying the project until you actually save up the cash. That may be more advisable than doing a lot of compensation gymnastics, because the problem with doing something like a collaboration deal, like all of a sudden, instead of you hiring an artist to work on the book and now you own the book, now two of you own the book. Now it's going to be exponentially harder to get any other type of deal done, especially if they have different outlook on life, different business model. Now they own half of what you just did, as opposed to you saying, well, you did this for me, I paid you, now I own it. Those are completely different business models, and you can save money in the short term by giving up half the IP. But if you just created Charlie Brown, you may not want to give up half of Charlie Brown to save a couple $1,000s up front.
Right.
You don't know what you made yet, because Charles Schultz didn't know he made Charlie Brown when he made Charlie Brown. So you have to be careful of using alternate compensation models, but there are alternate compensation models out there.
So
I hope that was not too convoluted.
No, just to clarify and make sure I understand it, it comes down to sorry if I'm loud in your ears there. It comes down to coming to a common agreement of whatever the compensation will be, regardless of what that is. Cash up front is, or figuring out the cash is best, but whatever you agree on, that is in the contract, and then you kind of you make sure that's in your contract.
Exactly. The page rate, if you're going to offer royalties on sales after $1 as opposed to upfront compensation, that's fine too. But whoever's taking that deal has to actually understand there may not be any royalties. The book may not break even and you may not get any profit. So they may be agreeing to get, like a lot of times I'll see deals where the artist will get 50% of like the net receipts from the sale of the book. Okay, but if there are no net receipts, because it's always in the negative, now that person just realized they spent 3 months doing a book and they're not getting paid for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that something that I know writing ends up being best, like having it in the agreement is the way, this is the way, but is that something that a verbal conversation about, you may spend 3 months and not get paid, are you okay with that? And before you write that into the contract?
Yes. Well, there's two ways to actually go about it. You could build that into the contract and then let them know, because what especially a lot of new writers and a lot of new publishers, they believe that their idea will automatically be a hit. And therefore, they actually couch the discussion as, well, by definition, this is going to sell 30,000 units. So you will automatically make this much money. when in fact, a new book entering into the market, struggling to get market share, if you sell 5,000 units, this is something that I talked about on my YouTube channel yesterday, you're probably in the ballpark of a brand new comic, because getting market share is not an easy thing to do. So yes, you should probably say upfront, if the only compensation you're providing is royalties, let people know upfront that there may not be any royalties. Now, if the only thing that you're providing is a page rate and they're getting paid upfront, they've got the better end of the deal short term. Because if there is no profit, or if the book doesn't come out, or if the whole thing sinks into the ocean because the tanker sinks, they still got paid. It doesn't make a difference to them. Now, conversely, if that book then becomes a series of multi-million-dollar films, they don't get anything because they got their page rate up front. They have to decide how they want to be a part of this project, and when they want to get paid, and how much risk they are willing to tolerate for the work that they do.
And, there's a number of things to consider as well. One is, when you say working with an absolute stranger, we're now in an era where you can do research on somebody before you engage them. I would say that's important. I would say don't get in business with an absolute stranger. Have some kind of contact, see if you two are on the same wavelength, if you believe in the same things generally in regards to the creation of this new project. Secondly, I can tell you that from a creative standpoint, no money up front and profits on the back end is a red flag. And especially one thing to take into consideration is it's much, in terms of labor and time, there's one thing for a writer to write a script, and there's another thing for an artist to produce pages. So going to something Gamal said, even if you could provide something that's reduced, that would go a good way towards the relationship. And the conditions of that, again, are laid out in the contract, but part of what the contract is about an assessment of the value that different parties bring to a project. Creators have a value and a publisher has a value. And so these are things to think about when you start thinking about collaborating, when you start thinking about putting together terms. It's really good to think about, okay, what are the options?
There's something that Joe actually mentioned that reminded me of something that I should have said before. The best thing to do when you're starting out with someone is what we like to refer to as the danger room session. You basically have somebody come in. Let's say you have an artist, you think you want to work with this artist. Instead of signing them up to do an 192-page graphic novel epic, sign them up to do 5 pages. If you can work with that person to do 5 pages, and what they produce is what it is that you're looking for, and you get a sample of what it's like to work with them. Do they hit their deadlines? Are they communicating? Do they take notes well? That is actually going to go a long way in the due diligence process, because like Joe said, you can look up people, you can talk to other people in the network. Have you worked with this person or not? What is this person's reputation in the industry? But the proof positive is, what do they do in those 5 pages? And if they do that, then the next contract that you give them can be pretty much the same terms as the first one, but you actually are giving them more money. They're giving you more pages. And that danger room session isn't going to cost you very much, because you're not giving them money for dozens and dozens of pages. You're only giving them money for 5. So that way you can save up money to just get that 5 pages done. Get that proof of concept. There may be a scene from your story. It may be a random scene that you're just playing with to see how they do it. But the danger room session is a very good tool in building a relationship with creative people that's not going to sink too much of your cash, and it's not going to eat up too much of their time.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
No worries. That's why people keep me around. Sure.
I want to go ahead and let them give where we can find them and give their plugs. Anybody have any other quick questions? Yes, no.
Quick question. So if you're doing everything on your own,
Can you hear them okay
Yeah.
from there? Okay, perfect.
Yes, I can hear.
Yes.
if you are creating, writing, and illustrating a children's book, legally, if you are putting the images and some of the content out there, like on your website and on socials, how do you not get thieved from the world? If that makes sense.
Basically, what you need to do when you are producing work on your own or producing any work, if you're hiring somebody to produce work, you need to actually establish your legal rights to that material. And the best way to do that is to file a copyright. And later on down the line, you can worry about trademark. We're not talking about trademark right now. Don't worry about it. Copyright is a very simple process to do. It does not, you do not need to pay an attorney to do it. It is not expensive. It costs $65 to copyright your book. Once you copyright your book and you establish yourself as the legal owner, you can then control how that intellectual property is distributed. If you then find that that intellectual property is being distributed in ways that you did not authorize and you are not getting paid for, especially online, there's something called a DMCA takedown notice, where you could actually contact the platform owner of whatever thing is basically someone's infringing on your copyright, and you can have that material taken down so that they're not able to sell your material. If you find your material is being distributed without your authorization, there's something called a cease and desist letter followed up by infringement litigation, where there are substantial penalties set up by the government to protect artists, writers, and other creative people from having their work stolen. So, but all of that is predicated on filing the copyright. Magic part of that is filing copyright is very easy. So I would recommend, if you're posting stuff, especially, if you're trying to use your pre-existing work to build up market share, to get eyeballs, before you start doing any of that, copyright your work at any version of your work that it is. You don't have to have the finished version. You can, as long as you have the latest and best version of your work, you can copyright that and then update the copyright later on when the book is finished. That's going to give you the legal foundation you have to make sure that people do not randomly make NFTs from your stuff and make money off of it without you.
Sorry, Snow said thank you. Yeah, I've actually been down that road before. So up to the litigation point. So if you want to have that conversation, that's fresh from the early pandemic shutdown memory. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. I'd like you both to give us any websites, social media, where we can find you, and also any projects, past or present, that you want to plug.
Okay, Joe, you go first.
All right. On Facebook, I'm Joe Illidge, ILLIDGE. Twitter, Joseph P. Illidge. I am Illmaster1 on Instagram because I wanted to shake it up a little bit. My website is josephillidge.com, where I provide a variety of editing and consultation services for creators. And one of my clients is heavy metal. So I'm the executive editor there, and you can feel free to go to Heavy Metal's website and see some of the exciting things that we're doing. And if anyone's going to be at New York Comic Con, see you there.
Yeah, so my mom kind of predicted the internet. So what she did was she gave me a name that's very easy to find, and there's nobody else in the world, I believe, that is named Gamal Hennessy. So if you go on Google and type in Gamal Hennessy, you will find me. You will find my website, which is Creative Contract Consulting. You will find me on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram, I think. And if you are thinking about building your own comic book company, I recommend actually checking out on Amazon or on my website this book, which is called The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing, which will give you a soup to nuts analysis and breakdown of everything that you need to build your comic book company. I also run an ongoing educational service called the Comics Publishing Institute, which helps people on a consistent basis understand how they can build up their comic book publishing company with a community of like-minded people who are all attempting to help each other and do the same thing. The project that I am working on that's going to be released next year is going to be the business of freelance comic book publishing. And I am going to be at half a dozen panels at New York Comic Con next week. So if you're going to be in New York for that, check it out.
So much NYCC FOMO. And thank you from Creators Assemble. You can find us at creatorsassemble.org. Also across the board on the social media at Creators Assemble, and also our Twitch charity TTRPG live streaming schedule will be available there. And thank you again to our friends at Knowhere. Here's Matthias with the plug.
Yeah, the humble host of the incredibly amazing guests here. You know, we both love Joe. Gamal is incredible information. You know, Creators Assemble doing a lot of wonderful things for everyone. So we at Knowhere Games and Comics are incredibly honored to host you guys. You can find us at knowheregamesandcomics.com or here in San Marcos, California at 125 Vallecitos de Oro in San Marcos. Or you can otherwise hit us up on all of our social media. We are either Knowhere Games and Comics on things like Facebook and YouTube, or Knowhere GC on Instagram and Twitter.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.